we're going to speak to Andreas Krieg, who's an associate professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College London, and he joins me live from there. As we heard from James Bays there, saying there's a lot of celebrations, but also a lot more that will need to be done for the country. It will potentially be a very slow process. He talked about political changes that are being made, economy, of course, because of these sanctions that haven't been fully lifted. What do you think is the priority for the Syrian people right now?
I mean, so far it's been a fairly positive development, considering the mammoth task that this new government is facing after almost 6 decades of a one-party, one-family rule. But the challenge is the primary challenge domestically will be building consensus around what it means to be Syrian and what Syria actually means as a multi-ethnic state, which is obviously a majority Sunni Arab country with a lot of different minorities, and whose minority concerns have to be somewhat represented, and some of the fears have to be accommodated and addressed as well. And that consensus building obviously is going to be very challenging, because you have international players who want to undermine and subvert that consensus building effort, some of them being Russia, Iran, potentially some Arab countries who disagree with the Islamist character of HDS. So you've got a lot of external factors and external players who are trying to manipulate fears and concerns on the ground. And obviously the new HDS government has to somewhat address them and kind of keep the calm, which is the primary factor. The secondary issue, obviously, as already mentioned before, is the issue of sanctions, economic growth. So the legitimacy and credibility of that new government very much rests on their ability to provide public goods to their people. So that is partially due to, reconstructing some of the infrastructure that's been destroyed, being able to pay salaries, and most importantly, obviously, getting investments into the country. And for that to happen, we need not just some waivers, as the US Treasury has announced this week, but we actually need the sanctions to be lifted, because after all, these sanctions were against the Assad regime. They weren't against the Syrian people, not against Syria. So it is unfair to keep the sanctions in place. And obviously the key problem is, despite the fact that we see Turkey and Qatar in particular, but also UAE and others trying to put money in, trying to provide humanitarian aid, trying to pay salaries, trying to help with energy security, after all, banks will stay and shy away from Syria as long as the sanctions are in place.
Of course, as long as there is uncertainty as well, they're less likely to invest, and that's the case at the moment, as we've seen the Syrian delegation from the part of the new administration doing a regional tour, trying to convince people that they will ensure that security in the country. But how is that possible when you have so many different groups, and as you said there, many different sects across Syria? Is Syria unified?
I think we're, quite surprisingly, this whole euphoria over the last 4 weeks showed that Syria is very united. There's a very strong sense of nationhood, of Syrian identity across the diverse demographic spectrum of the country. And it's important to keep this going, keep this euphoria going, to keep this together, despite the facts and attempts by external players to undermine it. The key issue here, then, the secondary issue that comes from it, is not just what communities on the ground feel, but also all these different armed actors that are roaming around the country, some of which have submitted or at least have forged allegiances with HDS and the groups that are now governing Syria. But then we've got obviously some armed actors that are defying that new political reality, most importantly the SDF or the YPG Kurdish element that's been supported by the United States, that at this point is still not agreeing to somewhat, come around and engage with the HDS. We've got also on the margins smaller groups that for the moment keep the peace because they're allowed to keep their integrity. Some of them have now agreed to integrate into a united military and security sector. Right. That also is going to be challenging because as some of the leaders will have to give up their privileges, they will potentially become alternative power hubs and potential warlords. So it's important to rein them in as quickly as possible.
That's when it comes to governance. But I just want to bring this back to the Syrian people, because this is a day of Syrians celebrating, some of them who have been through mostly a majority generational trauma, if you like, with many generations born outside. The UN is saying that an estimate of 115,000 people have returned to Syria in the last month, but there's millions of Syrians living abroad. Is there a reason why they haven't all gone back yet? And is there a potential that they will, or are they still waiting to see how things pan out?
think most people still wait to see how it's going to pan out. And I think the West, the international community, has a role to play here in building confidence and saying, we are backing this new transition, instead of staying on the margins and saying, let's see what happens. Because Syria on its own will not be able to do it. Obviously, we want the Syrians have to own this process, but there needs to be financial support to it. Without economic stability, without the stability on the ground of keeping the peace, and obviously without the confidence that the international community is backing this new government, people will most likely not come back in the short term. But I think there is an avenue for people to come back.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andreas Krieg. We'll have to leave it there for the time being. An associate professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College.